And I call the honourable member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak about the government's increase to the JobSeeker payment, the permanent increase of $50 per fortnight. Labor will support this increase because otherwise the almost 2 million people relying on this payment would not get that paltry increase of $3.50 per day. But I want to be extremely clear that this increase is completely inadequate. It is an insult to people trying to survive on this payment, particularly as we're in a global pandemic and a recession. People cannot find jobs, people are trying to get by on this payment, and the government is just pulling the rug out from under them. Let's not forget that this is a government where the Social Services Minister said that that increasing the JobSeeker payment, or the New Start payment as it was then, would just go into the hands of drug dealers. This is a government that peddles myths constantly about people receiving social security and the system itself. This is a government that says, oh, they get other supplements. Yes, they get the energy supplement, 65 cents per day. I'm not sure what the government thinks that is going to help with. They may get rent assistance, which by definition they only get if they're paying rent, and it doesn't cover their rent. So all these supplements that the government speaks about are not making a difference for people's lives. The devastating thing is that in this pandemic, in responding to COVID-19, the government actually did acknowledge two things when it delivered the coronavirus supplement and effectively doubled the JobSeeker payment to people out of work. It acknowledged, number one, that people cannot live on $40 per day. And I would add, they cannot either live on $43.50 per day. But they acknowledged that, and they also acknowledged that a decent unemployment benefit, a social safety net, has an important role not only in lifting people out of poverty, but in stimulating the economy at a time when we needed it most. And they delivered that. And at a time of peak unemployment, in our worst recession in many, many years, we actually saw the rate of poverty in Australia decrease. Between the introduction of JobKeeper, the wage subsidy that Labor argued for and the government introduced, and the increase to JobSeeker, we saw a decrease in poverty overall. We saw people protected from poverty. We actually saw, as a result of that doubling, that the rate of poverty among people receiving the JobSeeker payment reduced from around 80% of those people to around 25% of those people. And that is research from the ANU that I'm quoting there. So it actually went from, it didn't completely even alleviate poverty completely among job seekers, I'll note that, but it decreased it significantly. And here the government had a real opportunity to use that to reset and actually deliver a decent social safety net for Australians. Actually be like the society that we sort of claim to be, an egalitarian society where we look after one another and people get a fair go. But instead, this is a government that wants to push people into destitution. So what does poverty mean? Well, what I'm talking about there, where we actually lifted people out of poverty, that is the poverty rate as calculated as a proportion of the median income. It is a relative number based on the distribution of incomes of our entire community. But what does it mean to the people actually living on these payments? As someone at the early morning centre here in Canberra once said to me, poverty is trying to choose between baby food and tampons. Now let that sink in, because I think the people on the other side of this chamber obviously don't speak to people in their electorates, or they're just callous and they're ignoring it. That's what poverty is. And on the other hand, when they introduced this coronavirus supplement, we heard people receiving JobSeeker speaking of living with some dignity for the first time in a long time. Having some of the things that so many of us take for granted every day. Things like being able to put petrol in the car or even afford a bus fare. Things like getting a haircut, like buying your children a school uniform so they can fit in at school and not feel ostracised because they're living in poverty. Heating their homes, getting shoes without holes in them. These sorts of things that we in this place take for granted, and this government could have continued that and they are taking it away. It is an absolute disgrace. And the other parts of this announcement, which I note are not in legislation and will just be done by the Minister through regulation, are the mutual obligation changes, which are just punitive. They're all just part of this government's agenda to just really demonise people. I mean, what a joke to have, a dob in a dole bludger for employers. Employers don't even want this. They don't have time to do that. And they want people to apply for 20 jobs a fortnight. Where are these jobs? I ask this government. How about a plan for jobs? We're in a recession. And part of that is we've also had the Reserve Bank governor say that, a decent unemployment benefit is part of stimulating the economy. People on low incomes spend the majority of their income because they have to. And that money would be going back into our economies, back into our small businesses. This is a decision, this pathetic increase is driven by ideology, not economics, and certainly not the proper modelling that should have been done to set this payment. Now, Labor has long been committed to seeing this increased, and we have been arguing in this place for a decent, permanent increase to the JobSeeker payment, formerly New Start. At the last election, Labor committed to review the payment. Now, that was always about how much did the payment need to be increased by. There has never been any doubt that it needed to be increased. Just in the way there is no doubt that this increase is inadequate. It falls so far short of all the amounts that people have been calling for many years now. This increase, $25 per week. At the moment, the Australian Council of Social Services is calling for an increase of $25 per day. So you can see that it is well short. They'd previously called for increases of $75 per week and $95 per week, also well short of that. Now, as someone who has worked my entire career on social security policy and on looking at finding the policy answers to addressing poverty and inequality, I understand there are complexities in setting this rate. It needs to be done right. The government has the resources and the data to do that modelling right now, and they should have done it and delivered a proper increase. There are things you need to consider, and anyone who says that we don't need to consider this rate properly is ignoring both the depth of the inadequacies of our social security system, but also the power of these payments to lift people out of poverty, to stimulate our economy, and the important role that they play. In this country, we do not take the pride that we should in our social security system. It is the most powerful tool that we have to keep people out of poverty. We have child poverty at the moment. We have a rate of around a third of sole parents living in poverty. And it's only going to be higher when this government just, snaps back. Well, sorry, there'll be a $3 per day increase from the end of March, but removes the JobKeeper payment and the assistance before we are anywhere near getting out of this recession in only a few days' time. Instead, they could lift people out of poverty as they did during COVID. They need to look at where this payment should be set to ensure that people have a decent standard of living. Now, that is not necessarily the poverty rate as defined by like the OECD poverty line. Now, I completely agree with the statement that people should not be living in poverty. We don't need to have people destitute to have an incentive to work. Hello over there, that is a fact. You know, the incentive to work is all around us. That, you know, so much of our identity in this country is around our jobs. So much of, you know, our society is centred around work. The people in my electorate who are on unemployment benefits, who are dreading this reduction back to $43 a day at the end of March, they're not, you know, there's no doubt that a job is a better alternative to being on social security. And I think the people who would most argue that are the people trying to survive on this payment. The people who've been told that $3.50 a day is going to help them with that. You know, the thing that comes to mind is to say that it won't even buy a coffee. But these people aren't buying coffees. Yeah, they're not buying food. They're trying to survive. They're going to food banks. That has become the social safety net in this country because our government-funded social security system is so inadequate. It is the community sector that are keeping people alive. Yeah. And I'm not over-exaggerating this problem. That is exactly what it is. But coming back to the proper modelling and analysis that needs to happen, it is important that we look at the rate of the unemployment benefit, you know, in relation to the other payments, like the age pension, like the disability support pension. It is important that we look at it in comparison to the minimum wage. It is important that we look at it in comparison to the poverty line. But the number one most important thing is that we can guarantee that people have a dignified and healthy standard of living in this country. And we can do that, in my view, by doing a proper review of JobSeeker and of the social security system. And I think it should include what is called a budget standards analysis, where we look at a basket of goods and services that a person in a certain type of situation, a single person or a family with children, needs to live a decent life. Now, a lot of this work has been done by Peter Saunders from UNSW, which he did for ACOS in 2017, which was the basis for their original call for an increase of $75 a week. So the government could update that work and look at all these other factors with their proper administrative data of who is receiving these payments, and they could look at the data and they could work out an amount which would mean that people could live decently. People like Julie Stevens, who presented to the Senate inquiry on this bill on the 9th of March, and I would encourage everyone to read her testimony, particularly people from the other side of this chamber, about what it's like to have an aggressive cancer and be receiving chemotherapy, and just the fear for when this payment is reduced at the end of March on how on earth she is going to survive, how she is going to put petrol in her car to get to her treatments, how is she going to buy food. These are the issues facing Australians right now. You know, and we've got people saying that $3.50 is an increase. It is an insult. It is an insult to people living in poverty in this country. You know, Bob Hawke said in 1987 that no Australian child should live in poverty by 1990, and, you know, we all like to have a laugh about that. But he introduced changes to family benefits after that, and poverty among jobless families with children was reduced by 80% by 1994. Because these payments are powerful. It is the most powerful and important thing we can do to address disadvantage in this country. Number one is to make sure people have an income that they can live on, that they can have housing, that they can participate in their community. And this increase, yes, we'll support it, because that $3.50, you know, you couldn't stand in the way of it because people are so desperate, but it is not enough. It is not enough, Mr. Speaker. And I just wish that this government would look up from their demonising and their ideological crusades and talk to people in their electorates in this country who are really suffering. And it is really going to come to crunch time on the 31st of March when this assistance is ripped away from people. And
Order.
God help us.
The member